probably been the worst kept secret in Canberra. Finally, this afternoon, the Prime Minister announced that the Chinese Premier Li Quang is set to visit here Saturday, so at the end of the week. So the question now will be, will Anthony Albanese address the elephant in the room, which of course is China's growing hostility in our region, or will this just be another photo opportunity? Now, someone who is heavily engaged in watching what China's up to is Sky News contributor Chris Uhlmann, and I'm pleased to say he's in the studio with us. Why did he keep it secret for so long?
Well, he's second-guessing himself, isn't he? He's so worried now that he might offend the Chinese that he can't even say that the Chinese Premier is coming on Saturday. He refused to answer the question on a day when the Chinese delegation was wandering through Parliament with some of his staff measuring the curtains, checking out whether or not where the Chinese where the Chinese flags would go. So it is preposterous that he didn't speak about it before now, because of course he's waiting to see whether or not the Chinese are going to put out a statement and would do one at the same time. But this is a guest in our country. The Prime Minister thinks that he's managing this relationship with China. I think that China's managing him. Would they deliberately have chosen, they being negotiation between the Australian Foreign Affairs and the Chinese, a non-sitting week? Oh, look, to avoid that idea that he might be invited to address the Parliament? Yeah, that's a very rare thing, and it would normally be the President, not the Premier. So the President obviously did that back in 2014, and it shows how far the relationship's come in terms of how far it has sunk since then, in that there's no invitation to ever go. That was under Tony Abbott, wasn't it? It was, and Tony Abbott, I remember coming out of that being buoyed by the idea that the Chinese Premier had talked about, the President had talked about the possibility of becoming a democracy, something he routinely says and doesn't mean. Well, that would have been quite a feather in Tony Abbott's cap. It was, and at the time, don't forget, under Andrew Robb, that was when we signed the agreements with China, the free trade deals that we have with China, and it was all upside then until China revealed itself. It was hiding its strength and biding its time, but then we got to see the real China, and that's now a very aggressive presence in our part of the world. You and I know Albo reasonably well, you better than me. Is he going to front up to the Premier and ask him the tough questions? Taiwan, human rights in China, and the Australian guy who's still in prison there? Yang Hanjun, he has to ask on that one. So there's an Australian citizen who's on death row, and this is really a kind of hostage diplomacy that we have going there. So he has to raise that question. I'd be asking other questions, though. I'd be saying, why are you pre-positioning virtual bombs on our critical infrastructure, which is something China has actually done here? Think about that. If you planted a bomb on the Sydney Harbour Bridge, that would be seen as... So how... Explain that to me. So what they've done is it's under this program that China runs called Volt Typhoon. They've done it in the United States and they've done it here. They put malware into our critical infrastructure, which means if push does come to shove, the first we'll know about it in Australia is that lights will go out and some gas pipelines might blow up. That's the level of intrusion that we've seen inside our borders by China. Now, that to me would be one of the things that would be near the top of the list. What about trade? I mean, the Prime Minister today went on about lobsters and crayfish. I mean, I don't think that's the most important issue, but if you're a crayfisherman, you'd want your product to go back into the Chinese market. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this bloke's going to Perth. Yeah, but he's returning all the things that they took away. So it's like someone comes in and robs your house and then starts giving you your watch back and then your purse back, and you get really, really grateful for it. Don't forget that China used economic coercion against Australia. Why? Because at a time when a disease came out of China, which threatened our population and we didn't know how bad it was going to be, we spent $1 trillion, half $1 trillion trying to look after the population. If you're not going to speak up and say, we'd really like to know where this disease came from, because that might help us a bit. If you're not speaking up, then when do you speak up? And for that, we were punished. We were put in the freezer and there was economic coercion. So the fact that they've wound it back a little since then, that's a good thing. We should trade with China. I think that's a great thing. Should we trust China? No. We talked about, at the start of the program, the climate wars. I mean, you've been... How many wars on climate have you reported on? It started back in 2007. I mean, it's been going forever. So Peter Dutton, crazy brave, or is he right to call into question whether we can get to the 2030 targets and to continue to prosecute this argument about nuclear? Yeah, look, I think that it is a big call on his behalf because he's got to try and win back those teal seats, and we know the electorate's very, very divided. So there, I think that's going to make the concerns that his members have about winning those seats back very difficult indeed. I think he's probably picking the mark at the moment that people are concerned about cost of living. And what we will see in this transition, no matter what we do from here on in, it will be remarkably expensive. And don't believe this line that if you put more renewable energy on the grid, it makes it cheaper. It can reduce the wholesale price for a certain period of time, but the void it leaves and the transmission lines you need to build, that's
we're so far behind,
expensive.
aren't we?
Yeah. Well, 82%. We're at 40% wind and solar on the grid at the moment. We've got to get to 82% in the next 6 years. That simply will not happen.
Yeah, and Anthony Albanese doesn't accept that whenever you talk to him. Chris, great to see you. Thanks for coming into the studio.